with imagination at length and covering the role of imagination in the life of a believer. What we got into last week and what we wanted to start talking about and dealing with were dreams deferred. What happens when the things we dream about, the things that we hope for, don't materialize in what we think is a normal time frame? How does it affect us? How does it affect Christians? And this is all framed within the context of teleos, the good life, what we imagine and what we envision as being a good life or a good quality of living. And we talked at length. Where do we get those ideas? And what's the difference between our idea of what a good life looks like and what's God's idea of what a good life looks like? We dealt with those things, and like I said, we come to the point of dealing with what happens when, there's a difference, but what happens when I've been saved for 20 years and I thought it meant one thing and it's not necessarily happening? Or I've seen Christians that have been talking about a good life and nothing about their life really looks all that great to me. How do we reconcile those things? And there's as many obstacles to people achieving their personal idea of a good life as there are people. Nothing is given to us. Everything has to be earned. Everyone has a story. And for a vast majority of the population, that story doesn't include life rolling out a red carpet or accommodating our every whim, cooperating with our every plan. A person usually that is not experiencing what they would consider a good life generally says that it's because life has not cooperated with their attempts to attain one. And that's usually a pretty reasonable explanation because we all try. Nobody wants to have a miserable life or an unhappy life. We shoot for it, make good decisions, bad decisions, but what we shoot for ultimately, life doesn't always accommodate. God's people have a slightly different story. The red carpet doesn't roll out for us either, but we are, being the people of God, have a unique story to everybody else. And the majority of those obstacles to the good life tend to be internal. Consider that the kingdom, and we understand that the kingdom, good life comes from the kingdom, is not something that a person earns. It's something that is given. It's a product of God's grace through Christ, which causes some people to celebrate because my blessings and the good life is not something I earn. It doesn't matter how messed up my life has been. God has a plan for me and His grace, and means that I can have the kingdom and I can have abundant life. On the other hand, it confuses some people because they say, I've been in the way for so many years, and if it's a gift, why don't I have it? Why am I still struggling? Why doesn't my life seem to be good? Having spent years as a Christian, there are some who would not classify their experience as abundance. With this conundrum comes equivocation regarding what abundance really means and whether abundance is meant for this life or the next. This problem has been a persistent impediment for the people of God throughout the ages. Aside from defending the integrity of the faith against would-be usurpers and opponents, this issue is the most prevalent subject matter addressed in the letters of the New Testament. We dealt with passages from the book of Hebrews last week. Several passages where when you read that book, and we talked about, or I asked everyone to read the 11th chapter, and if you were really, really diligent, you would have gone back to the beginning of the book and read forward, so that way you could see what the 11th chapter was actually talking about. If you didn't, a lot of what he talks about is the context of Hebrews is that you had converted Jews or Judeans leaving the Jewish religion, becoming Christians, and things had gotten bad for Christians. So they were thinking maybe we'd be better off going back to what we used to do and where we used to be in the life the faith that we used to have. And the writer of Hebrews encourages them to maintain their faith by arguing that Christianity and the faith of Christianity is superior in every aspect to Judaism, and encourages them, once again, to maintain the hope that they had in a better life, because they all got saved or became Christians or became disciples of Christ with hope of a better life. The kingdom was coming and they wanted to be a part of it. Well, the kingdom didn't come quite as quickly as they thought it was going to. So now what do? What happens when our hope and our dreams and our imaginations for a good life don't quite materialize the way that we think that they're going to? That's quite a bit of what Hebrews deals with and where that comes from and what it's about. And so like I said, we have about 3 or 4 passages of scripture where he was encouraging people, don't give up on the promise that you've been given. Don't give up on your faith in that promise. You have hope of a better life, and just because it hasn't got here yet doesn't mean it's not coming. Doesn't mean that the kingdom's not coming. And we dealt with several passages along those lines, because when it's human nature. What we're talking about, what happens when the good life doesn't come when we think it's supposed to, is not new to us. And that's why we went back to the scriptures in Hebrews to look at it. When current situations diverge from our idea of a good life, the result can be very painful. One of the things that I talked about, and I wanted to go back over, is the effect that time has on faith and on hopes and on dreams. Time has a way of corroding the imagination, the anticipation. When you first get an idea of how things are going to go, you're excited. You've got a vision in mind of what a Christmas program is going to look like, and it's exciting and it's fun and it's fascinating. And then you get to 3 or 4 weeks into it, and time has a way of eating away at what you were excited about to begin with. What we talked about was that time gives room for doubt. Doubt gives way to fear. Fear grows into disillusionment. Disillusionment grows to cynicism, which leads to hopelessness or rationalization. How do we go from having high hopes in life to this is as good as it's going to get? Time. Time ravages faith and ideas and imagination. As time passed for these Christians and their persecution ravaged unchecked, those who had left their previous religions thought about going back, because doubt, fear, disillusionment, there's a very steady progression of what happens to hopes and dreams when they're not materializing in the time that we think that they're supposed to. And so we dealt with that some, and then we looked towards one of the verses that the writer of Hebrews penned. Said that we heard the same gospel as they did, but it didn't help them. He's warning them, don't turn back from the promise or from your hope the way that your ancestors did. And from that we went back to Numbers. And in Numbers we looked at the 10 spies in the wilderness, or the 12 spies who go into Canaan. 10 come back and say, we can't take the land. Land's great, it's got plenty of stuff, but we cannot take it. This writer is reminding, you find that in Numbers 14. Where the nation of Israel collectively decides that the report of the 10 spies who entered into Canaan and determined that the promised land could not be taken by Israel, when they decided that they were going to believe that report and ignore the 2 people who said that it was able to be taken. The 10 decided that what was necessary to experience a better life was such a huge task, it wasn't worth making the effort. So as we talked about before, they're right at the edge of something they've been waiting for hundreds of years for. They get in there and they see the giants in the land, and they decide, we can't take this land. This is our better life. This is what we've been hoping and dreaming for. This is what our fathers and our grandfathers and our great-grandfathers had prayed for and dreamt of, and we're right there, but we look, and this is where our good life is supposed to be, and there's a problem, and we can't take it. So let's go back to what we used to know. Time, fear, doubt, disillusionment. Either they didn't believe God was able to make good on his promise, or they didn't believe that God was faithful to deliver them into the land. As a result, the nation or the people began to long for the good old days of Egyptian slavery and resolved in their minds to return to Egypt. The greatest obstacles to experiencing abundant living are not those which are institutionalized, but those which are internalized. I wanted to go back over and hit that because I think that it's a very poignant issue to address. It's not the surroundings or the things that are already in place that are in your way that stop believers from experiencing an abundant life. It's the obstacles that they've internalized. These 10 spies who said we can't do it, imagine themselves and their God inferior to the established structures, institutions, and persons occupying the promised land. They then transmitted their imagined deficiencies to the people who adopted these perceived inadequacies as true. So you got 10 people who said we can't do it, we're not good enough, we can't imagine a way that we can possibly overcome this. They got around and started talking to everybody else, and before you know it, the rest of the nation, we want to go back to Egypt and be slaves. That would be better. Their idea of a good life shifted from a land of milk and honey to going back building bricks with straw because there were obstacles in the way that they imagined themselves unable to do. They didn't fight and lose. It's not like they fought and then ran because this is going badly for us. They just looked at it and said, we can't do this. Imagination. Do I imagine myself able to overcome what's going on? Oftentimes, people do not experience God's good life because they've determined themselves incapable of having such an experience. It's painfully difficult to effectively imagine a life experience that one believes themselves disqualified from attaining. A person with an imagination that is confined to the parameters of conventional reality will find it difficult to center their teleos on an unconventional kingdom. So God's got this ridiculously wild promise. This land with the giants is supposed to be yours. I'm going to give it to you. They get there and they say, we can't fight those folks. Well, nobody told you were going to have to fight them. I told you I was going to give you the land. But they looked at what they thought was necessary. They made up in their minds that this is necessary in order for us to experience our good life, our hopes, our dreams, our imaginations. We can't do it. It's not worth even trying. And the two people who said we can do it, they were ready to stone them, which honestly hasn't changed much today. The people who say it's doable, the people who say we can do this, the ones who want to elevate and want to push are the ones who everybody else who doesn't feel like moving tend to not like too much and want to disparage or throw rocks at or whatever else they can think of to do. Other people decide that pursuing an abundant life isn't worth the risk or the cost. To the nation of Israel, the prospect of annihilation by taking on a clearly superior adversary made the potential of the promised land not worth pursuing. While life is an exercise in risk-reward analysis, that's just a part of living. You decide, am I going to risk this? Am I going to invest this time, energy, whatever it is? That you've only got so much of it, and you have to make those decisions. People have to determine what's worth fighting for and what's worth settling for as an acceptable alternative. These folks looked at their good life and said, no thanks. Their dreams, what they hope, it's not worth the risk. Many people decide that effectively imagining something greater, imagining myself as overcoming, imagining myself as conquering, imagining myself as defeating what has beaten me or what people have told me can't be beaten, they decide it's not worth the perceived financial, psychological, emotional, material, or relational costs. The loss of the ability to imagine a better life for themselves and many people is a deeply rooted defense mechanism against the pain of past failures or messaging telling them that they don't qualify for it. Some people, the reason that you can't get them to dream big or think past their current situations or ask, you ask them, all the way back to the very first lesson, what do you want out of life? I don't know. And some people will get ticked off and irritated and cranky when you push them. It's because there's defenses they've already made up in their mind. It's not worth trying to imagine anything. I'm going to just go day to day and make the best of it, and whatever I get is what I get. For believers, this is not the life. That's not abundance. That's survival. We're not supposed to be surviving Christians. We're supposed to be experiencing an abundant life, and we're supposed to go through life with an imagination and anticipation of what that would look like according to what God gives us in His Word. The 10 made a few critical errors in judgment, and I've almost caught you guys up to where we dealt with last week. A few critical errors in judgment. They decided that their obstacles to their good life were beyond their ability to overcome. They rejected as impossible any sort of circumstances that would allow them to emerge victorious over things as they understood them. So they just, the two spies said, if the two said that they could take it, said, if God has favor, we're able to take the land. We're ready to stone them. Any possibility that this could actually go better than what you've already made up in your mind or imagined is possible, they dismissed. And then they determined it was not worth entertaining the idea of trying, to the point that the nation was ready to stone those who said otherwise. Most importantly, they forgot that the promised land was a gift to be received and not a prize to be won. Abundant living, teleos, our good life, for believers is not something we earn or work our way up to. It's something we position ourselves to be able to receive. Because God's good life, none of us can earn. None of us are that good. None of us are that gracious. It's a gift. And part of the problem is that we take ourselves out of position to be able to receive it because we can't imagine ourselves ever getting there. We're so busy being, and let me move. God never intended Israel to fight the inhabitants of the promised land. They weren't going to fight giants. He only needed to overcome their doubts about him, their doubts about themselves, and their doubts about their relationship with him. Ultimately, Israel's failure to enter into the promised land was more about how they saw themselves, God, and their relationship with God than the factors that were surrounding them. That's why I said that the greatest obstacles to experiencing a good life are not institutionalized. It's not the obstacles that are already there. It's the stuff that you've internalized about what you're capable of doing with God that keeps you from imagining and pursuing things that will get you to where God wants you to be. Likewise, there are no external forces capable of denying us the abundant life in Scripture. The writer of Hebrews reminds the diaspora that they don't have to retreat from the hope of rest, of the kingdom, or of a better life. He encourages them to continue to believe, desire, and imagine by putting them in remembrance of their nation's past failures, which is what we just talked about. He warns them, don't turn away from your abundant life the way that your ancestors did it at the wilderness. They were right there and decided, we don't qualify. We can't do it. We can't have it. And it's about how they perceive themselves, God, and their relationship with him, all within their imagination. He also reminds them of the heroes of their faith, which is what we're picking up today. Questions or comments before we move forward? Hebrews 11. Been talking about it, we finally got here. I have a couple more verses in here than you guys do because it's not directly relevant to what we're going to talk about. But starting at the first verse, faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence that we cannot see. Through faith, the people in the days of old earned a good reputation. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. Then in the fourth verse, he talks about Abel. In the fifth verse, he talks about, in the sixth verse, he talks about a man named Enoch, heroes of faith. In the seventh verse, he talks about Noah. You all passages pick up in the eighth verse. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when he called him to leave home and go to another land that would give him an inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. And even when he reached the land God promised him, he lived there by faith, for he was like a foreigner, living in tents. And so did Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. It was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. And so a whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore, there's no way to count them. All of these people died believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country that they can call their own. If they had longed for the country where they came from, they could have gone back. But they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That's why God's not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Then jumping down to the 39th verse, because he talks more about different other people. All of these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so they would not reach perfection without us. This writer, the Hebrew writer of Hebrews, reminds Judean Christians that their history is not only marked with a failure to receive the promise, but also contains a pantheon, a large number of heroes whose imagination-infused faith that propelled them into greatness. It's worth noting that this is the model for most legacies of greatness. There are times of cataclysmic failure throughout life of the best men, but that does not detract from the legacy left by the life of a good person. Rather, it simply points to their humanity. So the writer of Hebrews, he talks about where they messed up, but also points to the history of the nation and where they achieved greatness by faith. The 11th chapter of Hebrews, commonly known as the Roll Hall of Faith, wherein the author proclaims the legacy of faith inherited by the Judean people. He begins by providing a philosophical sense of the definition of faith. It is much more than the power of positive thinking or the high hopes and great expectations. Faith is what gives substance to and provide evidence of that which has not yet manifested itself into experiential reality. So we've heard that faith is the substance of things, hope for the evidence of things not seen. What that is saying is that it gives substance to and provides evidence for things that have not yet been experienced or manifested themselves within our realities. As it relates to imagination, which is the series that would be dealt with, faith is what adds affect to imagination. Faith is what allows us to become emotionally invested in the psychological notions of what things could be. You know, we can all imagine, fantasize about being a millionaire, about winning, about winning something that gives us a bunch of money. We can fantasize about that, but we're not necessarily emotionally invested in it. What gets us emotionally invested is the faith that what we have envisioned in our minds actually can happen, and actually is going to happen. That is to say, faith is what provides the emotional impetus to allow one's life and its life experiences to be centered on that which is unseen, unexperienced, or imagined. The entire chapter is filled with legendary men of faith legendary men and their faith-fueled accomplishments and endurance. Of particular relevance to this discussion is the imagination of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Jacob. These were the forefathers of the nation of Israel, whose life's expectations, experiences, and decisions were shaped by a promise that they did not see come into fulfillment. Abram and Sarah took the culturally unheard of and extraordinarily dangerous step of packing up their belongings and leaving home for destinations unknown. Most of us are familiar with this story. God comes to Abram and says, get your stuff and go somewhere. I'll let you know when you get there. Now, this was not the equivalent of hitchhiking back in the 60s. You didn't have a bunch of cities close together and you can just stick your thumb out and catch a road somewhere. You're talking about miles of desert. Nothing paved. You got bandits. The only people out there are bandits and wild animals. Get up, and it's a collectivistic society. Families close. Get up, you got 15, 20 siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, everybody lives in the city. Get up, pack your stuff, and go. And I'll let you know when you get there. It was a lot more dangerous than travel today. You didn't travel back then unless you absolutely had to. Nobody went on vacation. We're not going to go vacation and go check this out and check that out. We're staying put with our people because this is where we are, and this is who we are, and this is what we do, and this is where we derive our that. So for us, we hear the story. Oh, pack up and go, and we'll show you where. We realize that takes something, but keep in mind, you got Cleveland and you got Los Angeles, and there's nothing in between. Cleveland, Los Angeles, somewhere down in Mexico. That's the kind of landscape and the kind of danger that we're talking about. And I'll let you know when you get there. Upon they do so at the behest of a God that was not the God of their ancestors. Abraham, I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it was not the God of their ancestors, and it wasn't like all of us know the God of Christianity. We've grown up with him. We've heard the stories. We know that wasn't their family God. That wasn't who they served. This was a brand new relationship. God speaks to him, says, get up and go, and I'll show you where you go when you get there. Once they got to Canaan, which was the promised land, Abram sets up camp just outside the city. Then God promises Canaan to his descendants, of which he had none, at 75 years old. This land that you just set up a tent in is the land I'm going to give to your descendants. I got no kids. I'm 75 years old. That's done. I got a cousin or a nephew that I took in after my brother died, but I got no kids. Abraham was 75 when he received that promise, when the promise was made, and for the remainder of his life, his son's life, and his grandson's life, over 220 years, their idea of a good life was shaped by that promise. 220 years, this promise that they got from God dictated what they thought a good life looked like. The writer of Hebrews substantiates that claim by pointing out the fact that these men lived as nomads. And we already talked about that fact that people don't travel. Nomads don't have a house. They go from city to city to city. They just travel around, settle, stop for a minute, go someplace else. People didn't do that. But he says that they lived over 2 centuries with no place that they called home and lived out of tents. You know, at that time you were at least equipped to build up stone dwellings when you actually reached your homeland. Some people would build up stone structures that served as house, some kind of protection for the elements. But they didn't do that. They got to Canaan and they set up tents and lived out of tents for 220 years. Rather than settle in a land and build a home of stone and adapt the culture of the region of that land, these men lived in temporary dwellings that could be packed up and moved. Remember, they got a promise of a good life that's coming. And rather than settle in one spot and set up a permanent residence, they lived as though they had someplace to be for 220 years. The family of Abraham lived as though they had someplace to go. They experienced famine and fortune. They experienced family prosperity and family mess. Some of them were good men, others were scandalous. Through it all, they lived with a good life, a vision of a good life, rooted in God's promise. I got places to go, so I'm not setting up a permanent place. I got something that's laying up the road for me, so I'm not establishing a permanent dwelling. I'm set up to get up out of here and move whenever God presents the opportunity. I'm set to go somewhere else because I've got a promise of something better further up the road. These people of promise never relegated themselves to settling for current circumstances or situations as a new normal. Rather, they assigned normality to the imagination of their future identity. Their sense of self, hope for life, and plans for the future were not constricted to what was conventional or realistic. One man with no kids is not a realistic heir to an empire. One man with 2 kids is not a realistic heir to an empire. One man with 12 kids, not a realistic heir to an entire property. But they situated their lives and their life expectations around the idea that I've got a promise of a good life. These all stem from the promises of God, of the God of Abraham, passed to Isaac and Jacob. Too many believers have built permanent residence in mediocrity, dysfunction, complacency, equivocation, and abdication. We set up there and that's where we live, as though there is no promise. Our vision of a good life no longer resides in a promise of a kingdom or a promise of abundance. We don't live in tents, even though our situations aren't what we would necessarily like them to be, and even though our relationships and the dynamics of the people around us aren't necessarily what we like for them to be. We just set, this is where we live now, this is the normal, this is what I expect, this is as good as things are going to get, as though we have no promise. But the heroes of faith that he's pointing to, that accomplished great things that God was able to bless, lived as though they had something else coming. I don't know when it's getting here. I don't know how it's getting here, but I've got a promise. And I'm going to be ready to pack up and go whenever God gives the opportunity. However this is going to work out, we should instead take our example from our spiritual forefathers, whose lives were built on purpose, promise, and anticipation of an effectively imagined end. Note that these men did not have a plan to take their land. There was never a military coup plan. They didn't sit there and lay out blueprints. They just knew it's coming. I don't know how it's going to get there, but it's coming. God promised me it's coming. I'm not exactly sure how to. I'm not coming up with a plan. I go about living. They go about living life. Living life as though something was going to get there at some point in time, and God was able to bless them along the way. They understood God would give them the land. They simply lived life in anticipation of receiving it when it got there. There was no figuring out how to make it happen. They lived and thrived with their triumphs, tragedies, mistakes, and successes without forcing anything. So many of us are bent on forcing, accomplishing, making things happen, as opposed to positioning, living my life, making choices, making decisions with an expectation that God's got a vision of a good life. There's abundance waiting for me. I don't know how I'm going to get there. And some of us who are controlling, who are planners, who are analytical, who sit and figure things out and calculate and do the math and run through things. I remember sit down, add everything up, and see if this whole plan works. That's the way some of us are wired. God laughs when we make plans, and the devil has a good one. That might be the only time when the two of them laugh at the same time. I don't know. But they didn't try to figure it out. They just kept themselves in a position to receive it. This stands in stark contrast to what we talked about earlier, where their great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, 465 years, gave up their idea of a good life because they couldn't figure out how to make it work. It's a different perspective, their imagination. They didn't know what living in Canaan was going to look like. They didn't necessarily know how they were going to get there, but they had in their mind, this is going to be our land at some point in time. We can't take it. I can't make it work. I might as well just go ahead and live life. Keeping in mind and walking with God, expecting that somewhere along the line, we're going to get there. The writer of Hebrews observes that if they had not looked forward, they would have had occasion to look backwards. Some of us stay stuck where we are because we don't look forward to anything anymore. We don't look forward to what life is going to look like when I'm 40, 50, 60, 70. What's the next thing? We just go day to day. We have nothing that we look forward to, and we spend all of our time remembering the good old days, or looking backwards, or just looking at our situation and being stuck there. That is to say, absent effective imagination, their teleos would have shifted to something familiar and inferior to the good life that God imagined it. As an example of this, Abraham in his old age tasked his servant, I'm doing good. Abraham in his old age tasked his servant with finding a wife for his son and a womb to give the birth to the next phase of his promise. So Abraham has a miracle child. Abraham's old now. His wife has passed away, his first wife has passed away, and he wants a son for Isaac, or a wife for Isaac. He tells his servant to go out and find a wife for Isaac. But he gives them two conditions. One, don't take a woman from Canaan. Two, don't take my son back where I came from, because they're far away. They're living in or nearby Canaan. He tells his servant, go find, because all the marriages were arranged. And he tells him, go arrange a marriage for my son. But there's two things you don't do, no matter what happens. If you can't find him anybody, then you can't find him anybody. But don't get anybody from Canaan. And don't take my son back where I came out of. I got something else up the road. I got something that is dear to me that determines how I'm going to make my decisions. I've got a promise. I've got an imagination of how things are going to work out that I need to guard against. And so how I choose a wife for my son is going to be bound by protecting that promise. Abraham didn't want his son to be assimilated in the culture of the land that they were supposed to possess. Don't get a Canaanite woman because we're supposed to own this land. You know, I didn't plan on. Don't go get a Canaanite woman because we're supposed to own the land. If you marry one of them women, he's going to end up being one of them. And do not take him back where he came from, because that's familiar. That's where his family is. And if you take him back there, he might not come out. And we got something else further up the head. He had in mind a mind that looked forward with affective imagination and dictated every aspect of his life down to his choice of his son's wife. From this, we arrive at a critical aspect of the imaginative life. We have to be deliberative and conscientious about who we allow into our camps, our families, and our lives. Those who may cause us to assimilate our imagination to conventional reality, or to return to that from which we were called out of, present a hazard to our imagination of a good life, and are not to be brought within intimate relationships with us. In other words, don't let your environment and surroundings and the people that you draw close to you cause you to settle with what's realistic, what's conventional reality. What we live, we are people of promise. We are people with the promise of an abundant life. And there are plenty of people out there, Christians, non-Christians alike, who say, this is as good as it gets. No. I have a promise of something better. I have a promise of something more abundant. And no matter what I do, we deal with people, we interact with them, but I'm not going to, one, allow you to make me one of y'all. And two, I'm not going back to what I've already been delivered from. I'm not going back to a place where it would be comfortable and easy for me to forget that I got a promise. I'm not going to go back to what God has already called me out of and said that there's something more advanced just because I'm out here sometimes by myself, just because family and friends and the people that I've come from and the people that I'm used to are gone. My idea of a good life is set in the kingdom that God has promised me and not in the place from which he called me out of. Right. Lastly, the writer points out that none of these great men received the fulfillment of their imagination in their lifetime. In this microwavable, achievement-oriented society that we live in, that might sound troubling. These men were promised something and lived their life and made their decisions according to this promise. And none of them actually saw it happen. That might seem bothersome to some people if you were to talk about it, because what was the point then? What was the point? Abraham left his home, lived as a nomad, shaped his life around a good life that he never got to experience. And here's where we come back to everything that we've been talking about. When dreams don't necessarily materialize the way that we think they are. Some people want to give up and go back. Abraham was one who didn't and maintained faith. So what was the point? Isaac lived in anticipation of a teleos that was never realized. Jacob was so committed to this idea of a good life that he made his children swear to take his bones from where he was buried into Egypt, into the promised land when y'all get there. Now that was 400 years later. 500 years later if you want to round up. But Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, says, I'm dying in Egypt, but when y'all get there, take my bones with you. Because this is not where I'm supposed to be. Where I passed off the scene, where I'm stationed, as far as I got, that's not where I'm supposed to be. I got something else further ahead of me. Some of us get stuck. We experience tragedies. We experience calamities. We die deaths along the way of our life and forget that where we are is not where we're supposed to be. There's something else further up the line that God's got in mind for us. But when our imaginations become constricted to what people say is realistic, as opposed to what God has said that we can have, we put ourselves in a position where we forget that there's better, where we forget that there is greater, where we forget that there is abundance. The point, some of us would wonder what the point was if they never got there. The writer of Hebrews says they didn't receive what was promised, but they saw it from a distance and welcomed it. Some of us see our promises from a distance and despair. They saw their promises from a distance and welcomed it. Some of us see our promises from a distance and become sad because we see the huge gap sometimes between the two. And it bothers us and it can become troubling. And there is a battle, and we talked about that earlier, with time and circumstance to maintain faith and maintain hope and maintain imagination. But the point of living an effective imagination is less about the final destination than it is the journey. Even though none of these arrived, none of these that we've mentioned received the promise, they were all blessed along the way, and they all thrived. Abraham and Sarah were called out from a situation of barrenness and a land in which they had no prospects for their future, no hope of family or honor, and would have lived in the shadow of his father and his brothers, into becoming a man of faith and a man who experienced a life of miracles in relationship with God. Isaac was a miracle child who inherited from his father but multiplied his fortune considerably. Jacob, became Israel, prince with God, and birthed the 12 children that would become the nation of Israel. In each of their lives, they came to know God, the God of Abraham, in a more unique and personal way. So even though they didn't get there, God blessed them all along the way. Abundant living. Even though they didn't necessarily receive everything that they imagined and everything that God promised in their lifetime, it wasn't promised to Abraham, it was promised to his children. Okay, Daddy told me Canaan's my place. And then I passed this, okay, my granddad told me that this is supposed to be my place. And generation after generation goes by. What do we do with it? We are blessed. We multiply. They went from one barren man into a nation that was so large that the sand, they were the number of the sand and the number of the stars in the sky. Herein lay the tragedy of those whose imaginations are suppressed, compressed, or silenced because of the ravages of time. They're robbed of the blessings of what God would have done in their life as if they had lived as people with places to go. When we get to the point that we stop imagining and stop living our lives and seeing our lives with a central focus on what is being promised and the quality of living that is being promised, we start making decisions differently. We go into survival mode. We go into protection mode. We go into control mode, as opposed to living life to the fullest and allowing ourselves to be positioned in a place that God can bless us. Going back, we're talking about, we dealt with Israel, and we dealt with them at the edge of the promised land. And they were in a position where they couldn't imagine themselves getting there, and made the decision, let's go back, let's redirect. And this is so critical, because it's what happens to so many of us as we go through life. We have bright ideas, and you first get saved and you're excited and you're on your way to heaven, and that's the only thing that matters to you. And at some point in time, you get a reality check that life does not accommodate your imagination, and that there's a process and there's a progress. But the excitement and anticipation that you first felt, the excitement about what your life looks like now and about what it's about, doesn't necessarily have to pass off the scene just because the circumstances. You don't have to lose your imagination of what God is going to do for you in your life, how you're going to be able to influence your children, how He's going to elevate you at your job, how He's going to resolve situations within your home, the things that He wants to do to make your life better. It's not good right now necessarily, but I've got better waiting for me. And that expectation changes the weight of everything. When you know that where I am is not necessarily where I'm going to be, when you know that the circumstances that I'm struggling with is not the end of my story, that God has something greater planned for me, and I'm going to imagine a day where I'm not stressed out, and I'm going to imagine a day where these bill collectors aren't calling me, and I'm going to imagine a day where I'm not sitting down having to nickel and dime everything, and I'm going to imagine a day where actually my kids like me, and I'm going to imagine a day where the boss is not jumping on me, and I'm going to imagine a day where things are different and they're simpler. Some of us, now there's a battle to be fought to be able to maintain that. It doesn't come easy. It doesn't come light. There's a lot of people. The gospel was preached to us as well as it was to them, but it did not profit them, having not been mixed with faith. Those who decide that if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now, and center their teleos elsewhere, do so at a tremendous cost. This is how believers go through life with no sense of abundant living here on earth. Either their teleos is centered exclusively on the afterlife, or they have equivocated their expectations of abundant living and settled built stone buildings in their current situation of life. Believers, we are pilgrims in a strange land. Wherever we find ourselves, especially in the unpleasant times, but even in the good times, and that's what the beautiful things about it, even in the good times, there's still something greater. If it's a greater understanding of God, if it's a more intimate relationship, there's something more up the head. There's constantly something better. But especially in the times where we're struggling, when we're dealing with emotional turmoil, when we're dealing with loneliness and isolation and self-esteem issues and all of the things that plague us, we don't build our homes there. Yes, I'm here right now. And yes, it is a reality that I don't have a place that I can call my own. But God has a place from which I don't have time. God has a place for me that I can live in anticipation of and enjoy the journey along the way. That's where the old school mentality wouldn't take nothing for my journey. I've been through heartache, been through headache, endured storms, endured fires, went through things I wouldn't have wished on my worst enemy. Went through things that on my best day I didn't think I could ever deal with. You go through these things, you walk, because there's a promise of something better. And you find out at some point in time, you look back and wonder, how did I get here?
Amen.
Knowing, and it's because God has blessed, because He has promised. I received. I didn't work it out. I didn't figure it out. I wasn't that smart. I wasn't that nice. I wasn't that patient. But I received something from God in the midst of those experiences, and in the midst, my tent was pitched that when I got a chance to pack up and move someplace else, I got further along, stronger, healthier, wiser,
Amen.
Greater perspective, greater understanding of God, greater than what I could have imagined. And I'm not just talking about, this is the testimony of the believer. Greater than I could have imagined, but I never allowed myself to stop imagining myself come out of where I was. We cannot afford to allow what the world says is normal, what we've experienced in our families, what we've experienced from our friends, what we've experienced from our jobs, to dictate to us the way that the world is supposed to work. But we imagine something greater. As it pertains to each of us and the good life, those of us who have stopped imagining and desiring and pursuing better than what our current circumstance is have to ask ourselves why. The kingdom is God's gift to those who will walk in relationship with him and receive the abundance that he is offering. Did we disqualify ourselves and consider ourselves unworthy? Do we believe ourselves incapable or find the road to abundance to be too perilous and complicated? Do we find it difficult to believe that God intends better for us if we haven't received it yet? Or do we simply find the notion of imagining better too painful because accepting reality has become a deeply seated defense mechanism? As this series draws to close in the coming month, and I think we've got 2, maybe 3 more on this, in this series, we are going to work to equip ourselves to combat the powers and principalities that seek to bind our imaginations. We will work to find ourselves qualified to receive the good life and reject messaging from anywhere that tells us otherwise. Finally, we will seek to change the pictures of ourselves to align our identities with the images that God carries with us or of us. In the meantime, as we examine ourselves, let us continue to pray, Lord, help my unbelief.